E a kunui e a kurahi tēnei te mihi mai hakia koutou. Kei te mea hoki hokainga o tēnei rohe arako ngai tua huriri, nā rātu I te aki a tātou. Good morning, greetings, welcome to everyone. Wonderful to see you here for this Boma Impact session, a very special one today. My name is Kaila Colbin. I am the founder and chief executive of Boma, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you this morning. From wherever you may be tuning into, I would like to start, as I did with my mihi and te reo, by acknowledging mana whenua of the spot that I am broadcasting to you from. That is Nai Tua Huriri, Ngā mihi nui to them. With that, it is now my absolute pleasure to welcome our guest for today, Mike Bennetts, who is best known as the chief executive of Zed Energy. Of course, he has stepped down from that role now. I first met Mike in 2015. When we were running the Singularity U New Zealand Summit, which was a summit focused on the future of exponential technologies, certainly one very focused on automation, on electrification, and on sustainability. And Zed Energy came along, spearheaded by Mike Bennetts, and said, yeah, we'll support this summit. And it was kind of an unusual thing to go, why is a fossil fuel company supporting this summit that is focused, number one, on sustainability, number two, on electrification? And Mike and some of his colleagues shared some thoughts at the summit, and their perspective was, if we can't change things from the inside, then we're all in real trouble. And I will tell you, they were so authentic in their commitment to it. It was such an honor and a delight to work with them. We've of course stayed in touch since then, and it's a great friendship, allyship, collaboration. And I think Mike's perspective, having been the chief executive of a petrol company, but one who is so committed to taking climate action, is a perspective that I think we all really need to hear. So with that, I'm going to turn over to you, Mike. Thank you so much for joining us today. Over to you for your talk.
Tēnā koe, Kaila. Eina mana, eina reo, eina rangatira ma, kia ora koutou. Ko Mike Toku Ingoa, he Kaiarahi, Taumata Advisory, Taku Tūranga Mahi. Hi, everybody. I'm really pleased to be with you this morning. And like Kaila said, we've had a fantastic collaboration over many years now, and I'm pleased to be able to share a few thoughts with you. I did leave Zed on the 31st of March, which was 13 years to the day. So for 13 years, I was responsible for a significant amount of emissions, a significant impact on the natural environment. And I chose to stay there for 13 years because I was deeply committed to doing something about that. So in terms of today, what I'm going to mostly do is share my experiences of having that job and all the work that we did together, as opposed to what I'm now doing, where I'm off doing my own thing and trying to make a contribution more as an individual rather than being part of a large corporate. So I've been asked to cover three things. So what does leadership look like when you're the chief executive of a company that by last count was producing about 9% of New Zealand's total emissions through the products that we sold to our customers? How do we go about balancing off profitability and sustainability? I'm going to answer that by actually reframing that particular aspect of the presentation this morning, and then talk a little bit about what are the key obstacles and how can you actually overcome those, particularly as Kaila said, what about collaboration? What about innovation? How can technology actually accelerate how we mitigate climate change? And certainly how do we begin to adapt to clearly the effects that we're now seeing? So first thing I would like to do is actually share with you some data from a book that I read many years ago, but I still refer to it today. And like my starting point around leadership is, everyone in the company that I work for was a leader, is a leader, and therefore what was important to them, how they thought about things, was actually quite critical to whatever progress we made or not. So with that in mind, I'm going to share my screen. I'm only going to show you one slide. So you can see what's on the screen there in front of you. This is the classic 2x2 grid. And what I want to talk about is just the emphasis that companies put on their values, or what they say is important to what matters inside the company, versus clarity around employee values. So you can see the grid there in front of you, and I'm going to populate it with some numbers very shortly. But I want you to start to think about, if here we are, let's pretend we are the executives of a company. We're in charge of a company like Zed. And we actually want to see what can we do to impact how employee commitment shows up, or put another way, people's willingness to go the extra mile, or the emotional energy that employees are willing to commit to their organization. And so often companies drive down the left-hand part of that particular grid, where they either do a little bit around communicating company values, or they do a significant amount. So if you can sort of get your head around that matrix, then you would think to yourself, well, okay, if the company went out there and really told people lots of things around, this is what really matters inside this company, this is what's important, these are the things that we value, what sort of change do you think there would be in emotional energy or that willingness to go the extra mile? This is based on some research in Europe, but I think it's pretty universal, certainly based on my experience. And to get it right, here's what happens. So if you go out there and you really sing loudly, talk loudly, shout loudly about what's important inside the company, in actual fact, people's willingness to go the extra mile, that emotional energy goes back by a smidgen. And if you do very, very little about it, but you talk a little bit about it, you don't make a big deal about it, it actually goes up by a couple of %. Then let's start to think about actually what happens if you really help employees understand what matters to them, what drives their thoughts, behaviors, and actions. So a complete contrast to the emphasis on the company. What if you did it from a personal perspective? And here's what actually happens. Now, at one level, people find this surprising, but when you actually think about it for a minute, of course, the more people understand what matters to them, the more they actually do one of two things. They either realize, actually, this is not the place for me, and they leave the organization, in which case I think both parties win, because people don't do their best work if they're not at their most happy. And if they do realize, actually, what really matters to me is synchronous or a real match for what matters to the company, they go like, this is my place. Yeah, this is where I can really make a contribution. So I wanted to share that with you, because one of the first things that Z did way back in 2010, when we first became a company in our own right, is we actually helped people understand what mattered to them. And that really did enable us to then find a match between what mattered to them, what was the best brand positioning, what's the sort of strategy that we want to pursue. So sort of leave that thought there with you. It's both counterintuitive and, of course, obvious at the same time, because when people come into running change programs or getting after big things inside companies, they so often start by shouting loudly about what's important to the company. And in my view, they completely miss the opportunity to align what matters to individuals with what matters to the company. And so one of the things that Z did early on was actually commit to what it's called its sustainability stand. Most companies would have called that a sustainability policy, but Z called it a stand, because in Z language is very important, because it was what Z stood for. And if you think about the importance of resonating with individuals, if you go out there as a boss and say, our policy on sustainability is this, some people start to tune out when you say our policy is, because policy is not the sort of thing that gets people really excited. On a cold, wet Wellington day, you don't get out of bed in the morning and go, oh, I really want to go and implement that policy. But if you call it a stand, you talk about what we stand for, that's more emotive, and that gets people better connected what matters to them, and then therefore they're more likely to sort of come to work with enthusiasm while the rain and the wind is all around them. So Z developed that sustainability stand, published it in November 2010. But I actually want to read you something that I think is really, really important. I'm going to actually read it because I want to make sure I get it word perfect. Is that there's a professor called Gary Hamel from Harvard Business School, from the Harvard Business University, and I'm going to quote from him. And he says, the role of top management is to design context rather than invent content. And if I was to put that into practice, as we did with Z, at the time we went through the exercise of saying, actually, what is the given context? What's the context that Z exists within? Actually, we found that really, really easy to do. And so the context was, we are right in the middle of the problem. We have a 30% market share of the New Zealand's transport fuels, which actually account for overall 18% of New Zealand's total emissions. The given context was, we market products that can contribute up to 90% of a commercial customer's carbon footprint and up to an estimated 25% of a household's carbon footprint. Sustainability comes at a cost, and we're a low margin business with very, very poor returns on capital. And whatever we will do will be seen as greenwash. So that was the given context. So you can imagine the sort of actions that flow or frankly don't flow when that's your context. But the active leadership, according to Gary, is that actually you should be designing context. So in contrast to that given context, the generated context was, natural resources are scarce and increasingly expensive. The world has a limited capacity to absorb carbon emissions and waste. We at Z can be at the heart of the solution. we have an opportunity to make a difference towards a more sustainable future on a scale that very few companies in New Zealand can. And customers will back us as long as we admit when we got it wrong and act consistently with our values and what we say we stand for. Now, you may have had some sort of emotional response to how I spoke about that, and I'm sure that if you actually read that, you could really see the contrast between the given and the generated context. So I think one of the first acts of leadership around sustainability is to generate a context within which you can take meaningful action, you can commit to things that sometimes you don't always know how to do, and then you take all of your talents and skills and you apply it to the gaps that emerge between what you're committed to and what you know how to do. And you do also then get after the things that you do know how to do, because that's sort of your bread and butter. You know how to manage projects, how to allocate capital, etc. So a couple of key points to get in there early on is aligning personal values with the company values really is the way to leverage employee action and commitment around the things that really, really matter. And of course, sustainability, I think, is one of the things that matters most inside any organization. And generating a context that allows for actions and commitments to flow freely and for people's best talents and skills to come to the fore is really, really important as well. So what does Zen do? And that given context was really easy for the executive team to word and to language and put down on a bit of paper. The generated context was a heck of a lot harder. So as much as I spoke about it in my reading of it, it wasn't easy, but actually it was well worth the effort. So from that generated context, we were able to publish the sustainability stand in November of 2010. Part of the way in which we informed ourselves on that was we went and we met with our enemies, or what you could call our foes. And what I mean by that is there are just people whose views are quite understandably 100% or diametrically opposed to what Z does. And I absolutely get that. So one of the things that we took on, one of the acts of leadership that we took on, was to go and actually meet with those people. So I wrote as an example, I wrote a personal 2 to 3 page letter to a number of those people and invited them to dinner. And when I say it was a letter, it wasn't, hey, I'm Mike, I'm the chief executive, please turn up at this dinner. It was actually, I told them what I was committed to, about the process we were going through, acknowledging they wouldn't want to meet with me, let alone be seen in public with me. But I really appreciate the chance to connect with them and hear what's on their mind, what they would expect the company in the unique privileged situation like Z to do about sustainability. And we actually had three dinners in different locations across the country. And we first thought that these dinners might sort of go from, we'll start at 7, it'll probably all be over by 9 o'clock, and we'll awkwardly leave the room. We were still going in most cases at 11 or midnight. And in all cases, one of my colleagues and I, we would then draft up what we had heard before we went to bed, and we emailed it to those people to say, this is what we heard last night. We just want to check in with you. That's exactly what you need to leave us with. So we got some amazing insights by reaching out to and being very authentic in our willingness to engage with people who would classify themselves as foes to what we're all about, or who we could have, again, the context might be these people are our enemies. We should not be listening to what they say, as opposed to these folks have something really legitimate to contribute to our thinking, and actually let's go and create the conditions under which we can actually authentically hear what they have to say and use that as input. So that was a really, really important part of actually creating that sustainability stand. Once it was debated and approved by the board, we actually publicly displayed it. It was put on our internet site for everybody to see. So a number of leadership actions flowed from that. There's a lot of actions that flowed from that, but I want to concentrate on a couple of specific leadership ones. The first one was actually transparency. So Z adopted at the time the most contemporary or progressive reporting standard that there was. So back in 2010-11, it was sort of GRI, that eventually moved to IR, and now it's TCFD. So I apologize for those of you who have no idea what I just said, but the point being at the time, there are 3 generally accepted reporting standards, and Z followed the most progressive and challenging of those from the very beginning. And those were part of our annual reports that we would share with our stakeholders once a year. So we made ourselves publicly accountable, not for just what we said we would do, but actually the progress we were making or not against each of those. At one stage there, we established a channel which we called Ask Mike. This is another way of reinforcing transparency or reinforcing our commitment to listening. So Ask Mike was actually if you like, a product that we put on Facebook, where I would go onto Facebook once a quarter between 7 o'clock and 9 o'clock at night and answer any and every question on the chat on Facebook. The first time I did that, I think I did an okay job, but it was frankly quite overwhelming because I was there trying to answer all of these questions. And yeah, we had a couple of hundred responses come into that. We learned from that. So next time we did it, we actually had a team of people who were managing or moderating the input as it came in. It would say to me, Mike, here's a question on this. I would quickly dictate it, and then they would type up the response. So that enabled us, frankly, me to get through a lot more responses. And so we grew from about 200 comments or questions being put to us over that 2-hour period to something like 400. At our peak, we were answering about 800 to 900 comments and questions in that 2-hour period. And we actually moved to the extent that we were doing Facebook Live, where I would hold the phone in front of my face and questions and comments would come up live, and we'd do that in 10-minute segments, 3 of those across the 2-hour period. And I would actually, I was in the spotlight and I would answer those questions. And of course, then it's very, very transparent. If I get asked a very, very difficult question and I choose to miss it, everybody can see that. So unlike, say, when people post questions on the chat, if we don't answer the question, that's less visible by way of no response, versus when Ask Mike is live, that's very, very different. And we call it Ask Mike, not to actually make it all about me, but we realized one of the prevailing actions that people took is there was never a personification to a company. Not that I want to be the hero of the company, but usually it's some nameless, faceless spokesperson who goes out and deals with the real issues that are on people's minds. The counterfactual to that was put the boss out there live, dealing with the things as they happen and respond to that. So very, very visible active leadership around that. A couple other things that I think are worth mentioning. Z put an internal price on carbon. So one of the challenges around sustainability is our teams come up with amazing ideas on something, and they say, look, if we do this, if we spend this money, we can reduce our emissions. And so often that money request is competing against the choice about investing in infrastructure or investing in ways to improve the customer experience. So in Z, we put an internal price on carbon, so that actually we could say, look, if we don't undertake this initiative to reduce our emissions, or put another way, by putting a price on it, we could come up with an internal rate of return on that investment. So we related it like an investment in the reduction of our operational emissions, rather than having something like that kind of can occur like a cost, competing against, as I said, the chance to invest in new infrastructure or improve customer experience. So we did that in 2 ways. One, we set the price, because what Z could not reduce in its operational emissions, it would offset. So it would buy carbon credits to offset those remaining emissions. And therefore we had a price for which we could then say, right, that's now used in the business case. Let's go and say, right, if we buy, as Z did at the time, moved its entire company car fleet to hybrids, those cost more than a normal petrol vehicle. So therefore, with the internal price that we set on carbon, we could actually work out what's the better value. And it was a no-brainer to invest in those hybrid vehicles. In actual fact, last calendar year, Z took the decision to move its entire company car fleet to fully electric vehicles. And where it can't, we do have some utes. We are using hybrids in the utes, but all the actual company vehicles are electric. So again, some visible acts. By pricing carbon internally, it created a much more commercial understanding around where we invest in sustainability, rather than incurring the cost of sustainability. The other thing that Z did, I think, is an opportunity for others as well, is we sat down with our 10 largest suppliers, or largest by way of the carbon footprint that we generated together. And we developed what we called performance contracts. So we set mutually agreed targets, and we had a set of mutually agreed actions we would take to reduce the common carbon footprint we had between ourselves. So for example, that opened up the opportunity to, rather than have daily deliveries to our convenience stores, in some cases where we were able to, where we didn't compromise food quality standards, we moved to every second day, or perhaps twice weekly, so that vehicles weren't coming out, if you like, with half a load on board and then driving back and doing that every day. We would drive out once every 2 days with a full load, and therefore we were halving those emissions between us as a customer and our very, very good suppliers. So just a couple of ideas about the way in which, by being transparent about our policy, measuring our performance, telling people we were open for business. Frankly, in my view, I think we were overwhelmed with ideas and opportunities as a result. Now, the last comment I'm going to make on leadership, I'm going to ask Kaila to share a video with you, beautifully titled The Dancing Guy. But I think it's a video that enables you to fully appreciate the role of leadership that exists all the way through, in this case, how to start a movement.
So ladies and gentlemen, at TED, we talk a lot about leadership and how to make a movement. So let's watch a movement happen, start to finish, in under 3 minutes and dissect some lessons from it. First, of course, you know, a leader needs the guts to stand out and be ridiculed. But what he's doing is so easy to follow. So here's his first follower with a crucial role. He's going to show everyone else how to follow. Now notice that the leader embraces him as an equal. So now it's not about the leader anymore, it's about them, plural. Now there he is calling to his friends. Now if you notice that the first follower is actually an underestimated form of leadership in itself. It takes guts to stand out like that. The first follower is what transforms a lone nut into a leader. And here comes a second follower. Now it's not a lone nut, it's not two nuts, 3 is a crowd, and a crowd is news. So a movement must be public. It's important to show not just the leader, but the followers, because you find that new followers emulate the followers, not the leader. Now here come 2 more people, and immediately after, 3 more people. Now we've got momentum. This is the tipping point. Now we've got a movement. So notice that as more people join in, it's less risky. So those that were sitting on the fence before now have no reason not to. They won't stand out, they won't be ridiculed, but they will be part of the in crowd if they hurry. So over the next minute, you'll see all of the those that prefer to stick with the crowd, because eventually they would be ridiculed for not joining in. And that's how you make a movement. But let's recap some lessons from this. So first, if you are the type, like the shirtless dancing guy, that is standing alone, remember the importance of nurturing your first few followers as equals. So it's clearly about the movement, not you. Okay, but we might have missed the real lesson here. The biggest lesson, if you noticed, did you catch it? Is that leadership is over-glorified. That yes, it was the shirtless guy was first, and he'll get all the credit, but it was really the first follower that transformed the lone nut into a leader. So as we're told that we should all be leaders, that would be really ineffective. If you really care about starting a movement, have the courage to follow and show others how to follow. And when you find a lone nut doing something great, have the guts to be the first one to stand up and join in. And what a perfect place to do that, TED. Thanks.
Yeah, what an awesome video. Now, believe it or not, that was a prompt to me, albeit at the time not directly, to lean into things at one level, be a lone nut around the Climate Leaders Coalition, which is now is a collaboration of about 100 organisations across New Zealand that represent a very significant part of GDP, that represent about 50% of New Zealand's total emissions. And so those climate leaders got together and said, rather than just act individually, what can we do by collaborating? What can we do by working things together? What can we do by challenging one another? What can we do by being publicly committed to this in such a way that we sign a pledge and we publish our results around our progress or not every year, and so on. So if you want to learn more about that, I'd say go to the Google Climate Leaders Coalition and have some more about that. But that effectively was, in my view, a great example of a lone nut, some early followers that then eventually turned into being something quite substantial, to the extent it's the only example of its kind in the world at this scale. There are probably 2 or 3 others in the world that I'm aware of. The US and Australia have a similar coalition, if you like. However, the scale of New Zealand, where 50% of the emissions, or the companies that cause those emissions, have got together and are working on it, is at a scale that is not just seen in Australia or the US. But yeah, really, really good leadership lessons in there. So if you Google The Dancing Guy and have a read of it, have a watch of it, and just pick up those lessons again. In terms of balancing competing demands, a couple of comments I would make on this is that it's so often, and I think incorrectly spoken about, the competing demands as you go about balancing profitability and sustainability. So one of the things that we did at Z that I think was very good very early on is we chose to define sustainability in a different way. we said in order for us to be a successful company, we need to be sustainable economically, socially, and environmentally. So if you like, we created 3 legs to the stool rather than have this dynamic where there is, the competing demands between profitability and sustainability. If Z is not environmentally sustainable, it will lose its social license to operate. If Z does not commit itself and effectively transition to the low carbon future we all need, its core business will become economically unsustainable. If Z does things that have a significant impact on social outcomes, it will actually have an impact on its economic outcomes, because customers say, frankly, I'm not going to shop at Z anymore because they are the bad people. That's the first thing that you would do. And I think part of this is we so easily fall into paradigms or past-based models about how we should think about things. And I think it's very, very limiting when you think about the competing demands between profitability and sustainability. Einstein said, if I had 1 hour to solve, he said, if I had 1 hour to save the world, I would spend 59 minutes defining the problem and then 1 minute generating the solution. So I think it's really important when it comes to whatever you want to do around sustainability, as a leader or in the role of a follower, actually, how are you defining the problem? So the example that I've just shared is Z just chose to define the problem as not about competing demands, but actually being sustainable across 3 legs to the stool. I also don't like the word balance either. So sometimes people talk about balancing between profitability and sustainability. I think balance by its very nature implies, like 1 in, 1 out. In order to maintain balance, it's obviously on an apex. Again, I think it's a very, very limited way of thinking about things. I prefer to talk about harmony. So balance implies 1 in, 1 out. Harmony implies that you need to actually have harmony between 2 or more variables. So what I mean by that is, if you think about harmony, then you can start to balance off what you may take as a cost in the short term to be a benefit in the long term. Because if you're talking about balancing, you have a cost in the short term, everything is automatically defined by the short term under a balancing model. Whereas if you think about harmony, you can start to bring into their other variables like time, rather than cost and benefit within the same time frame. I do think one thing companies should do, and actually I'm very disappointed New Zealand as a country does not have this, is to develop a marginal abatement cost curve. So what that means is as simple as saying, these are all the options we have to reduce carbon, and they come at this cost. And this is the impact of that. So if you say, at the example of the country, if we moved all petrol cars to EVs, this is how much it would cost, and this would be the benefit. If we chose to replace all of the industrial heat in New Zealand that is fueled by fossil fuels and move that to a zero carbon alternative, this would be the cost and this would be the benefit from that. So what I mean by that is, and I was with this particular chief executive yesterday, he came to me a couple of years ago and said, Mike, I've got this long list of things I'm looking to do in order to reduce my operational emissions. And he said, I'm just kind of stuck. I just can't get them all done. And I said, well, just don't do them all. And of course, he was horrified. He said, well, you're the convener of the Climate Leaders Coalition. Why are you telling me not to take action? And then we got into the notion of this carbon cost abatement curve to say, if you plotted out what are all of your options, then you can actually start to say, what's the best bang for my buck? Now, please don't interpret that as following the path of least resistance, where you choose to do the thing that's the easiest and cheapest thing to do, because the whole notion of the curve allows you to see at what price, what is the benefit that I can get. But unless you know what all of your options are, it's really hard to actually decide what you should do. Or put another way, you cannot but go down the path of least resistance. And so when I was meeting with him yesterday, he said to me, that was such great advice. He said, all we did was take 2 actions that had the biggest impact, and we got those done really quickly, really promptly, and made a difference, rather than having this long tail of activity that we were trying to do in such a way that we just were not effectively prioritizing. That's certainly something that I think in terms of managing your way around what we sometimes, again, poorly call competing demands, is if you have that abatement cost curve, then you're actually able to see what all your choices are, and you can go after some bigger impact, longer time frame type things, and you can obviously go after the easy wins if that's the appropriate thing to do for you as well. I do think there's an important part of this is to remember not to be so driven by current circumstances when you do make some of those decisions. I'll give you a really good example. If you went back 6 months ago, an ETS unit in New Zealand would cost about $85 a unit. And last time I looked, it was in the low 50s. So if you were economically justifying your investment, because you'd say, rather than pay that cost by making this investment, I reduce my emissions, and therefore I don't need to buy a credit. If you're looking at that today at $50, you might say, well, I'm not going to do that because it doesn't make sense. But I think all you're really doing there is being driven, in my view, too much by what's happening right here, right now. So yeah, when you are making investment decisions, I think as business leaders, it's really important to remember if you're investing particularly in capital, like vehicles or plant and equipment, you are probably only making 1 or 2 of those decisions over a 10-year period. If it's a car, maybe between 3 and 5 years. But if it's a piece of plant or machinery, you may be deciding on something that might last for 10 or 20 years. So you do need to factor that into your decision making rather than be driven, as I said, by carbon prices are only $50 a tonne today. It doesn't make sense to make that investment into that type of vehicle, that type of plant or equipment, as opposed to actually over the next 10 to 20 years, if it's equipment, we'd have to be thinking about what will the price of carbon be over that period. Now, I know some of you would say, like duh, that's so obvious, but it's really hard when you are a decision maker, where you do have limited resources, you do have to prioritize it. In my view, it's too easy to be driven by current circumstances and context rather than the generated context that I spoke about earlier, and putting into the appropriate time frame with the perspective of harmony rather than balance. Actually, I am making this decision once for the next 10 or 20 years. How do I think about that versus being so driven by what's frankly in front of your face? And my last point on how to get the right harmony around this as well is sometimes it really helps to take a risk perspective. So if I was to be very dramatic about it inside Z, we could say, if we do not transition to a low carbon future, then we will not have a business, which has the consequence of having no value to the company. Now, of course, it's not quite as simple as that, but I do think that often business leaders underuse risk as a way to open up opportunities, options, ways of thinking about things, rather than, as I said, being too close-minded, whether it be by way of time frame, current context, such that they get really, really trapped by the paradigm we live in today, rather than saying, actually, if I don't take action, if I don't make meaningful progress, then there are significant risks in my business that are very, very small today that become very, very large and will be very much in my face in 2025 and 2028 and 2030. So business leaders are usually pretty good at risk. And I think one way to think about sustainability is to come at it from a risk perspective, whereas so often in the organizations I've experienced, people come at it more from a rah-rah type or a passionate, committed way, which is we have to fix this because the world's melting down. A really, really legitimate perspective that I think could be working more in harmony with a harder-edged risk focus to say, actually, it should be a perspective of both rather than rah-rah, or it's all about risk. The harmony between both, I think, will open up more ideas and opportunities. But if I was to move to sort of how do you deal with the what we would call the key obstacles? So I think that the first thing to note is, are these obstacles real or imagined? Are they future obstacles, or are they past-based obstacles that you have a story around? So you have evidence for it. You say, let's take the carbon price. Carbon prices have never got higher than $85 a tonne. Therefore, that's an obstacle for us making an investment. Now, I personally think it's highly unlikely carbon prices will be capped at $85 a tonne. Now, I don't know exactly what they will be. Actually, I could say they will be $200 a tonne. I just don't know exactly what year it will be $200 a tonne. But I think that's the first thing to understand is, are these obstacles we see in front of us, like really reflect and challenge yourself, are they real or are they imagined? And often when I talk about they're imagined because they are past-based rather than necessarily predictable for the future or something that you stand for in the future. So one way to deal with obstacles is you do need to take action. I think far too often businesses and business leaders in particular find reasons for not doing something to deal with an obstacle rather than take action. There's a very good framework that's been popularized by a guy called Dave Snowden called the Cynefin framework. It's a Welsh word, so I'll spell it Cynefin. And it talks about ways to deal with problems. And in Dave's framework, there are only 4 types of problem. And I actually think sustainability or the issues around climate change is a complex problem. And Dave's model I love because it requires you to experiment, to test and learn, to try something, to learn under the complex model approach. Whereas so often people try to put, in Dave's model, climate change or sustainability into being a complicated problem for which there is best practice. All we have to do is find the best practice and implement it, and everything will be okay. In my view, sustainability is a complex problem. Therefore, the notion of finding best practice and implementing that is likely to be insufficient. So have a look at that framework. I'm not going to spend any time talking you through it, but it may open up some things for you as a way to think about what is the action to take, because we so often find ways to rationalize taking inaction because we've incorrectly defined the problem as being complicated rather than complex. Clearly, it's really important that you generate the context within which you can take action, or put another way, how those obstacles can occur to you in a different way. And I don't mean just simply changing them from the language of obstacle to the language of challenge. That might help, but I mean like fundamentally changing the context from, as Zed did, from the given to the generated context. You do want to make some future-based commitments. Yeah, I'd strongly encourage you in dealing with obstacles to stand for something, put yourself in the future, even something as simple as pretending, hey, we're all sitting around the table, the executive table, or whatever table it is, in 3 years' time, discussing how successful we have been at overcoming the obstacles around sustainability. Let's talk about the situation. Let's describe it like it's really there. Let's talk about it as if we are around that table in 3 years' time. Let's document that. Let's compare it to the current reality. And of course, there's a massive gap. And that's what you take action on. You take action around the gap rather than a story you have about the past or about the way in which you have this relationship to the obstacles that you have. You do need to note that some circumstances are transitory. Yeah, whatever you see as an obstacle today, is it really going to be an obstacle in that way forever? Can you take a risk-based approach to that such that it's no longer an obstacle, it's now a risk that you have to take action around, as opposed to an obstacle that stops you from taking action. I do think that, coming back to Kaila's opening comments, the opportunity to collaborate in both the development of your implementation plan and the actual execution of it is just awesome in what I call the village of New Zealand. There are so many people, businesses, individuals, NGOs, government organisations or entities that care about this stuff. Trying to solve it on your own, I don't think is actually possible, or progress can be made, but we won't actually solve the really big issue. But there are so many more ways to collaborate. And I do think one thing we have learned from COVID is actually the ways in which we can collaborate are much more accessible today than what they were before. Because of course, in lockdowns, we had to learn how to collaborate internally in a very different way by using technology, by using shared documents, by using video conferencing, by being able to connect up with the world in a very, very different way. So I think we're far more technology abled, and dare I say it, we've overcome the mental obstacle of collaborating without being in person to such an extent that there are new ways that we can open up those opportunities for collaboration. I can give you a whole lecture around human-centered design and the innovation process. I just sort of, in my closing remarks now, to sort of point you to that. There are lots of ways of working that are quite normalized inside companies today by way of innovation or human-centered design that I think could be increasingly applied to the challenges and obstacles around sustainability, rather than being limited to how do we manage customer experience, for example. So we already know how to do a lot of this stuff. Let's change the scope, or where we apply those ways of working, where it's how we use technology, or the very really good disciplines and practices around human-centered design, or more broadly, innovation. That's pretty well where I would end it. I'm not looking to have, and I certainly hope I haven't given you the answer in sharing what I have shared. What I've tried to do is skate along the surface of a number of things that would open something up for you, and then pointed you in directions like the Cynefin framework, the dancing guide, things like generating context as ways for you to sort of deepen that further yourself. So with that said, I'll now pass you back to Kaila, and we'll go to some Q&As.
Tēnā koe, Mike. What a fantastic kōrero. So much gold in there, so many nuggets, so many insights. The difference between a policy and a stand, the idea that the role is to design context, not generate content. Your story about the dinners with the folks that some people might perceive as your enemies. So much richness in there. One thing I just do want to touch on is the practice that you elaborated on for doing those Ask Mike sessions. First of all, what an extraordinary act of courage. And of course, we define courage through the level of vulnerability associated with it. And our definition of vulnerability is risk, uncertainty, emotional exposure. And so you being out there answering those questions, a huge act of risk, uncertainty, a huge act of emotional exposure. And, you mentioned that it wasn't to make it about you or about heroism. What I heard in there was not heroism, but accountability, personal accountability as the leader of the organization. And that is the kind of thing that we want and need to see from our leaders. So just really want to mihi to you for that. I will just say we have questions coming through. I have so many questions myself that I almost don't want to encourage people to share their questions, but I would be remiss in my job if I didn't encourage people. We're not going to do 800 questions in 20 minutes, despite Mike's skill at that. Please do share your questions via the Q&A. I do see one question that has come through from Richard McIntosh, and I will ask it, but I don't want to encourage this behavior. So don't other people do it through the chat. Through the Q&A, that's where the questions go. Let me just start with a simple question from Alex Radley. What was the name for the Harvard article about the role of top management being to develop context, not create content?
I can't remember, to be honest with you.
Okay.
What Gary's, talk about Gary like he's a mate of mine, like Professor Hamill said, I remember reading that thinking, wow, that is so on point, because it was consistent with my own experiences and it challenged me to do a better job, frankly. So I remember the quote. I don't remember where it came from. Gary Hamill, did you say was his name? Hamel.
Great. Hamel. That should help Alex find that. I will ask Richard's question. What support did the board play? What role did the board play in the journey?
Yeah, they were our partner. Right, we were partnered together, so it wasn't like management. Much as I spoke about, we recommended something to the board. We were very much in partnership around that, and I do think that when you've got big, challenging issues in organisations, you need to have a partnership between the governance layer and the management layer. Like you're all in it together. Like that's why generating context is so important. So, hey, board, do you think there's a different context here between the given and the generated context? Well, in this context, we have to partner together. And so context is everything. Once you get that right, well, it's not everything. It's certainly everything at the start. Once you get that right, then you then move on to the next challenge. If there is not shared context, then you're in deep trouble.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm going to ask a question from Jack, and I'm just going to read it in its entirety. What are you doing to shift, or what were you doing when you were in that role, to shift behaviors away from using fossil fuels? That is true leadership to me in this space. You have to realize that society is addicted to your product, but that your product is destroying the planet. If you're willing to risk profit and image for the good of human beings and the planet, then you're acting in a way that understands the problem. You can't keep selling more petrol. Eventually, we will run out, even if we don't reduce emissions. You also can't just wait for other people to adopt climate-focused behaviors. If you are enticing them to continue their consumption of fossil fuels, you almost don't want your customers to buy your product if you take the problem seriously from a long-term vision.
Yeah. Spot on. And I'm sure however I answer this, Jack, I'm not going to satisfy your concern. I just want to acknowledge that. But what I do want to say is we have a role to do both. Yeah, unfortunately, I'll use the word unfortunately, fossil fuels are by far the most economic alternative to use for so many energy solutions in the world. I'm not defending it. I'm just that's a very viable fact. And one thing I do like the way in which the government have talked about this, they talk about a just transition. So Zed could say, let's just stop selling fuel and move on to something else. The demand for fuel is still there. Poor people can't afford to buy an EV. Poor people can't afford to do many, many other things. They are solely reliant upon that. And this is what that might help, Jack, is that Zed invested significant money trying to explore and bring to market alternatives for customers. So, for example, Zed spent $60 million building or developing, designing and building a biofuels plant in Auckland. It took a waste product from the agricultural sector called tallow, animal fat, that would otherwise be used in candle making, I think it is. It goes overseas. We said we can turn that into a biofuel that significantly reduces carbon emissions. If you count the entire life cycle carbon in a biofuel versus a fossil fuel, it's a significant reduction. We built the plant, we spent tens of millions of dollars. We went to our customers and said, here you go, here's a solution that will reduce your emissions. Will you pay us 3 or 4 cents a litre more? 3 years ago, we shut that plant because customers, and I'm not saying all customers, but we did not have enough customers who were willing to pay 3 to 4 cents a litre more to reduce their emissions by 5%. They'd have to pay a lot more to reduce it by 100%. So that's part of the challenge that we as a company had, Jack. We said, how can we use existing infrastructure like pipelines and vehicles to come up with a lower carbon alternative to fossil fuels? And then what do we need to do about investing in the alternatives? By the end of this calendar year, 20% of Z's service stations will be EV charging capable. And that's on a pathway towards something like 40% in a couple of years' time. So there's significant money being invested in the EV type alternative, and Z has spent significant money and tried its best to meet a customer need around the alternative, and it just got uneconomic. So it's like, how much money do we need to spend for that? And equally, I'd point the finger at government. The government had a mandate when we first started that. They then took the mandate away. We continued with it anyway. Customers wouldn't pay for it. The government said they'd put another mandate in place. And then about 8 months ago, the government took that mandate off again. So there's a huge reliance upon, I think, the right match between customer need, our Z's ability as a supplier to meet that need, and frankly, supportive policy that doesn't change every couple of years. And Jack, I probably haven't answered it for you, but mate, we gave it a really, really good go. And there is a point at which you've got to say, it's not working anymore economically. We've got to pivot to find another way to be environmentally sustainable. What I would say is Z has reduced its operational emissions from 50,000 tonnes 6 or 7 years ago to 20,000 tonnes last year. So where Z could, if you like, look after its own backyard and make its own choices in its own business, reduced emissions by whatever that is, 60%. If everyone in New Zealand did that, yeah, we wouldn't have the problems that we have.
Thank you. That actually, your final comment there leads into a question that I had, which was at the beginning of this talk, you shared a bunch of stats of the percentage of emissions that Z is responsible for and all of that. Has Z been able to move the needle on that since you began this work?
No, if anything, Z's emissions has gone up. It was about 5% in 2010. Z acquired another company, a competitor of ours. We actually did that because again, if we wanted to move from being in the middle of the problem to being at the heart of the solution, we actually felt we had a bigger footprint. If we were serving more customers, that would give us more opportunities to make a difference in the transition. So it wasn't a selfish desire just to grow the size of the portfolio to generate more profits. It was to generate more scale such that we could make investments and have that available to more customers. So now it was 5% in 2010. It's 9% today. That's partly informed because the demand for the products has grown. So it has grown, but it has shifted. There is more growth. There's less growth in petrol. There's more growth in diesel. So unfortunately, New Zealand relies a lot upon diesel to move things up and down the country. Even rail still uses diesel to some extent. That has grown. Jet has obviously been affected by jet fuel affected by COVID, and it's now recovered. It's now coming back, but it's still less than what it was pre-COVID. And petrol is now declining. Z did some work and said, look, and we got it wrong, I think, in the sense of when we talked about it, people thought we were defending a position in 2030 or 2035, whereas what we were saying is based on all the data we see, this is the outcome for petrol demand, this is the outcome for diesel, this is the outcome for jet. As I said, it was interpreted as being we are saying that's what we're striving for. We weren't saying that at all. We're saying unless policy changes, unless the economics change, this will be the outcome. And that outcome being petrol demand being 35% lower in 2035 than what it was in 2020.
Thank you. We have a question through from Teariki, who says, seeking discomfort is a common theme in your language. What has been the most challenging climate change leadership moment in your career? And I would suggest that you could answer a challenging climate change leadership moment. You don't have to cast through all the moments to find the most challenging.
Yeah, I think there's two. Kia ora, iho, te ariki. I think there's two challenging times, actually. I'll speak about it a little bit more generically. I think it's when you're the lone nut, as per the video, when you're the only one doing something that is, frankly, bloody hard. And then when you let people down. What I mean by that is, and I think Jack's a really good example of that, is when you say you'll do something, you give it a go, and it doesn't turn out as you thought, and you have no alternative but to stop that particular activity, or certainly pivot to something quite different. I find that really personally challenging. I like to think I'm a person of my word. I'm very happy being a lone nut for a little while anyway. I like to have a fast follower. But then it's when I haven't met expectations. Because I like to, my biggest disappointment in 13 years at Z is that I did not move the dial. I have failed. I put a sustainability stand out in 2010 that said, we will reduce New Zealand's reliance on fossil fuels. We will reduce the intensity of the products that we sell, and we will use less and waste less. Third one, done. First two, absolute failure. And 13 years later. And at the time, those were really scary things, lone nut things to say. They're very ordinary in today's world. But I failed on that one. And I feel the only reason I came into the industry was to make that change, and I failed. And I let people down.
Your courage continues to astound me. We have a question here from Edward, who asks about the viability of Zed's plans for EV chargers. Obviously, most EV users charge at home. So how can that be a viable path forward? It can't be profitable, Edward says, to keep every petrol station open, selling only electricity as petrol demand declines to non-profitable levels.
Yeah, so I have to be careful how I answer that one, because I'm not employed by Z anymore. And there's things I know that are not in the public domain. So I'll do the best that I can. Z would think that New Zealand's likely to be very similar to Norway. Long, skinny-ish country, blah, 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 blah. So we spent a lot of time in Norway, China, West Coast US, trying to understand how this market would evolve. We think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from Norway. In Norway, about 85% of charging is done in the home, as per the question. About 10% is done at a destination, and only 5% done on what you'd call on the road, in the way that we currently buy petrol and diesel. So what Z has said is that it is going to invest in locations beyond its own network. So it will invest in the business premises. And Z already does that today with fuel, where it puts a diesel tank in someone's backyard so they can fill up their trucks. So Z has said it's willing to invest in on-premise solutions for customers. Z already owns an electricity retailer called Flick Energy, and has recently moved to have 100% of that. So Z is able to come into the home, and Z is working with other partners at destinations like shopping malls, supermarkets, such that the infrastructure would be there. So Z is thinking differently about its network, or its footprint for EV, as being different to petrol. And there will be locations where it makes a lot of sense to have charging co-located with fuel alongside a convenience store. And in some locations, that will not be the right thing to do. A really good point made about the economics. Again, I won't be too specific, but I would say it's generally accepted around the world, based on markets more mature than New Zealand, that as you invest in charging infrastructure, if things go well for you, you will not be cash break even until possibly year 6 or 8. Generally accepted. I'm not giving anything about Z away on that. So that makes it really challenging. It's like, at what point do you invest? Do you go early for all the right reasons? Or do you wait for companies who go early to go broke, and you buy them and scale up that way? Or do you come in later on when actually it is profitable and you invest at that stage? Given what Z is committed to publicly since 2010, it is choosing to go early and acknowledge the consequences of that, the economic consequences.
Thank you. We have a question here from Nick Morrison, who asks whether you have an opinion on the degrowth philosophy.
I don't have an opinion, actually. Well, I do have an opinion. I'm not well informed enough to share it, and I'm not sitting on the fence on that one. I was asked to contribute a piece of thought leadership on this particular topic about 3 weeks ago, and I declined, because I said, look, I just don't think I really know enough about the various perspectives on that to have an opinion of my own. It's on my list of things to do in terms of better understanding it. I'd say I have a superficial understanding, and that's not a place to make a comment from. I think I'm really intrigued by it. That's why I want to learn more about it.
We have a question from Claire, a simple one. What was the internal price of carbon different to the external price when you put that internal price on carbon?
No, we didn't. I think we priced it at $100 a tonne, knowing that there's many years that these investments cover, at the time where the cost might have been 20 or 30. Now, I may be wrong in saying that, but the $100 a tonne comes into my mind for some reason. So I apologise. It was done many years ago, so I can't quite remember. But the intent was to actually create a way in which we could better compare the economic cases around investing in reductions versus investing in customer experience.
We've got time for just one or two more questions. We've got a question here from Natalie. Do you think that perhaps more global industry business leaders need to adopt a culture of regular, transparent, open partnerships and collaboration across all sectors and with the public to adopt a long-term sustainability strategy? I'm just going to assume on your behalf that the answer is clearly yes. So I might expand on that question or add to that question, Natalie, to say, do you think it's possible? Do you see movement in that direction? How do you think we get there?
Yeah, I certainly think it's possible. So TCFD, God, I forgot what it stands for. Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So it's an entity that got together and said, here's the rules of the reporting game. New Zealand has adopted that. We've given it another name to make it unique to New Zealand, and it's more or less the same, but there are some differences. That comes into effect for full reporting for the top 200 organisations in New Zealand in next year, whatever next year is, 2024. I think that's a good thing. A standard reporting for the top 200 organisations as defined by the government. I think that's really, really good. And I do think things like the Climate Leaders Coalition is a really great example of that. There's a pledge that we took in 2017 when we first started that particular group. It's evolved a couple of times. It's now on to probably its third iteration or revision, and it's pretty challenging. And that's, again, if you Google that, you could actually go and see what it says. I think businesses can do that, and businesses must do that. The challenges we have in the space are just, frankly, too hard for a company to solve it on its own, and it's too hard just for collective businesses to solve it. It requires the happy meeting place between, government policy that doesn't get dicked around with, too frequently, committed industry collaboration or business collaboration, and where possible, customers playing their role. Not every customer can afford to buy an EV. Not every customer could afford to pay for a biofuel as a premium to the fossil fuel. But where companies and individuals can, I think they have a role. Z has an app that allows people to offset their carbon emissions. I've used that. Well, I did. I have EVs now. I don't use a petrol vehicle anymore. But that's one thing Z was trying to give customers the choice to say, where you don't have the choice but to buy the fuel, we will give you the choice to offset that with permanent native forests in New Zealand, and we don't take a margin on that transaction.
Beautiful. We are out of time. I know we could talk to you for hours, Mike. It's always so interesting. There's always so much to dig into, so much nuance, so much complexity there. I, again, just applaud so much your leadership, your courage, your vulnerability, the stance that you take, the willingness to put yourself in that incredibly challenging position to try to move the needle from within the heart of the problem, shifting that to being the heart of the solution. It's been such an honor for us to host you. Team, we will be sharing the video from this talk shortly. We will also be sharing a snippet of it that's maybe more easy to share on social media. Please do share it far and wide. You'll be getting that in your email. Thank you so much for spending your precious, sacred, non-renewable time with us. We really value your time and attention. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Mike, for being here. Ka kite anō. Take good care, everyone.
Ka kite.